The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound Margaret had heard for hours, until she heard something that made her blood run colder. Then the foredrip flowing through her veins. Laughter, her children's laughter, floating through the partially open door of her hospital room, like poison in the air. "God, I thought she'd never have that heart attack," came David's voice. Her eldest son, the one she'd put through medical school, with her own bare hands. "Do you think she can hear us? Even if she could, what's she going to do about it now?" Sarah's giggle followed, sharp and cruel. Margaret had worked 3 jobs to pay for Sarah's wedding just 2 years ago. Margaret lay perfectly still, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow and controlled. The doctors had said she was stable, that she'd make a full recovery, but her children didn't know that yet. They thought she was dying. And this was how they chose to spend what they believed were her final moments. "I've already called the realtor about the house," Michael whispered. "Her baby boy who used to cry when she left for work. Prime real estate in that neighborhood. We're looking at least 2 million, maybe more. Don't forget the business," David added. "Mom's catering company has contracts worth hundreds of thousands. We'll need to liquidate quickly before word gets out about her condition." Margaret's heart, the one that had nearly failed her yesterday, began to pound with a different kind of pain. For 43 years, since their father died, she had given them everything. Every penny, every sleepless night, every sacrifice had been for these 3 ungrateful strangers who shared her DNA but clearly not her heart. "Should we make the funeral arrangements cheap?" Sarah asked with mock concern. "I mean, she's not going to know, and we'll need every penny for ourselves." Their laughter resumed, a sound that would haunt Margaret forever, not because it was the last thing she'd hear, but because it was the moment she finally heard the truth about the children she'd loved more than her own life. As they continued planning her estate's division outside her door, Margaret began planning something else entirely. They wanted her dead. Fine, she'd give them exactly what they wished for, just not in the way they expected. As their voices faded down the hospital corridor, Margaret's mind drifted back to a different time, when those same voices had called her mommy, and meant it with pure love. She could still feel the ghost of small hands tugging at her uniform as she prepared to leave for her second job of the day. Little faces pressed against the window watching her walk to the bus stop in the pre-dawn darkness. It had all started 40 years ago, when James collapsed at 35 from a massive heart attack, leaving her alone with 3 children under the age of 8. The life insurance barely covered the funeral. And suddenly, Margaret found herself staring at a mountain of bills with nothing but her high school education and a fierce determination to give her babies everything their father would have wanted them to have. She remembered those early years like scenes from someone else's life, working as a hotel housekeeper from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, then rushing home to kiss scraped knees and help with homework before heading to her evening job at the diner. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford, but watching David excel in science, Sarah blossom in dance classes, and Michael discover his love for music made every exhausted moment worth it. The private school tuition had meant taking on a weekend catering gig, preparing elaborate meals for wealthy families who never knew their cook was surviving on 3 hours of sleep and leftover sandwiches. But Margaret had refused to let her children settle for less than the best education money could buy. She'd watched other single mothers make different choices, and she'd sworn her babies would never know what it felt like to be looked down upon or left behind. By the time David was ready for college, Margaret's weekend catering had grown into Mom's catering company, a business built on 16-hour days and a reputation for perfection. She'd mortgaged the house 3 times to pay for medical school, law school, and Sarah's expensive liberal arts degree that led to nothing but complaints about how hard life was. Every milestone had cost her something. David's graduation meant missing her own mother's 70th birthday. Sarah's wedding meant emptying her retirement account. Michael's failed business ventures had cost her the vacation she'd been planning for 20 years. But she'd given gladly, believing that love was measured in sacrifice, that a mother's job was to pour herself out completely for her children's success. She'd thrown herself birthday parties they forgot to attend, spent holidays alone while they made excuses about being busy with their own lives. She'd listened to their complaints about money troubles while writing checks she couldn't afford, watched them live in houses she'd helped buy while she made do with the same modest home she'd raised them in. Margaret had told herself they'd grown distant because they were independent, successful adults, living their own lives. She'd convinced herself that their increasingly rare phone calls and shorter visits were signs of her success as a mother. She'd raised children who didn't need her anymore. How magnificently, tragically wrong she'd been. They didn't need her love, her guidance, or her presence. They just needed her money. and now they were counting the hours until they could collect it. The sound of expensive shoes clicking against linoleum announced their return, and Margaret forced her breathing to remain steady and shallow. They gathered around her bed like buzzards circling carrion, their hushed voices carrying the weight of carefully calculated greed. "I've done the math," David announced with the clinical precision he'd learned in medical school. "The house alone should net us close to $2 million after taxes. The business contracts and equipment, probably another $800,000. Then there's her investment portfolio." Mom always was surprisingly savvy with money. "Thank God for that," Sarah muttered, and Margaret could hear her rifling through something that sounded suspiciously like her purse. "Because Kevin's gambling debts won't wait, and the credit card companies are getting nasty. I need at least $300,000 just to get back to zero." Margaret's heart clenched. She'd known Sarah's marriage was troubled, had even offered to help when Sarah had mentioned financial stress 6 months ago, but Sarah had brushed off her concern, insisting everything was fine. Now Margaret understood why her daughter had been waiting for a bigger payday. 300, that's nothing, Michael scoffed. "I owe almost $500,000 between the failed restaurant, the defaulted business loans, and the mortgage on that condo I can't afford. I was literally facing bankruptcy next month." "Were you ever going to tell Mom about any of this?" David asked, though his tone suggested he didn't particularly care about the answer. "Why worry her?" Michael replied with a laugh that made Margaret's skin crawl. "Besides, this works out so much better. Clean slate, no awkward family discussions, no lectures about responsibility." Speaking of clean slates, Sarah chimed in, "I already talked to that budget funeral home on 5th Street. We can get her cremated and have a basic service for under $5,000. No point in wasting money on some elaborate affair when she won't know the difference." "Cremation's perfect," David agreed. "Quick, cheap, and we won't have to maintain a burial plot." "Smart thinking, Sarah." Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. She'd buried her beloved James in the cemetery's most beautiful section, had visited his grave every week for 40 years. These monsters wanted to burn her body and forget she'd ever existed. "I've already started looking at vacation properties in Cabo," Michael continued dreamily. "Once we settle the estate, I'm thinking of taking a year off. Maybe write that novel I always talked about, and I can finally divorce Kevin without worrying about alimony." Sarah added with genuine excitement, "With my third of the inheritance, I'll have enough to start fresh, somewhere warm and expensive." "The best part," David said with satisfaction, "is that we won't have to pretend to care anymore. No more guilt trips about missing Sunday dinners or forgetting phone calls. No more walking on eggshells around her feelings." They were dividing up her life like pieces of a puzzle, erasing 40 years of love and sacrifice, with the cold efficiency of accountants closing a ledger. Dr. Harrison's voice cut through Margaret's tormented thoughts, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. "Mrs. Coleman, I have wonderful news," he said softly, checking her chart. "Your latest tests show remarkable improvement. The damage to your heart was minimal, and with proper medication and rest, you should make a complete recovery." Margaret's eyes fluttered open just enough to see his kind face, weathered by years of delivering both hope and heartbreak to families like hers. She'd known Dr. Harrison for 15 years. He'd been James's cardiologist too. In those final weeks, "How long before I can go home?" she whispered, her voice deliberately weak and strained. "Another week of observation. Maybe 2, if we want to be cautious. But Margaret, you're going to be fine. You have many good years ahead of you." Good years. The irony wasn't lost on her. As Dr. Harrison left, Margaret closed her eyes and let his words sink in. She was going to live, but her children had already buried her in their hearts and minds. They'd spent the afternoon planning her funeral while she lay 3 feet away, and now they'd go home to sleep peacefully, dreaming of their windfalls. But Margaret Coleman hadn't built a successful business and raised 3 children as a single mother by being naive or weak. She'd simply been blinded by love, choosing to see the best in her children when the evidence of their selfishness had been mounting for years. The missed birthdays, the forgotten holidays, the way they only called when they needed money. She'd made excuses for all of it. Not anymore. That evening, when the night nurse assured her that visiting hours were over and her children had gone home, Margaret reached for her phone with steady hands. Her first call was to Thomas Brennan, her lawyer for the past 20 years. "Thomas, it's Margaret Coleman. I need to see you tomorrow, but it has to be completely confidential. Can you come to the hospital?" Her second call was to her accountant, Janet Morris. "Janet, I need a complete accounting of all my assets and I need you to research some charitable organizations for me. Children's hospitals, scholarship funds, organizations that help single mothers. Her third call was the most important one of all. Rosa, it's Margaret. I know it's late, but I need you to come see me tomorrow. Bring your nephew Carlos, the one who's studying law. I have a proposition that might change both your lives forever. As Margaret hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. The thrill of taking control. Her children wanted her dead. She'd give them exactly what they wished for. But first, she was going to teach them a lesson about love, loss, and the consequences of treating family like a business transaction. Thomas Brennan arrived at Margaret's hospital room the next morning with the solemnity befitting a dying woman's last wishes. He'd been practicing law for 35 years, but he'd never been asked to participate in such an elaborate charade. Margaret had convinced him with one simple argument. Thomas, you've seen what grief does to good people, and you've seen what greed does to bad ones. Help me find out which kind of children I raised. When David, Tsar, and Michael arrived for what they believed was their mother's final will reading, their faces wore masks of appropriate sorrow. Margaret watched through barely opened eyes as they gathered around her bed, each one stealing glances at Thomas's briefcase like children eyeing Christmas presents. Given your mother's condition, Thomas began gravely, she asked me to review her will with all of you present, so there are no surprises later. He opened the folder containing the carefully crafted decoy document. Margaret Coleman, being of sound mind and body, leaves her entire estate to be divided equally among her 3 children. The relief that washed over their faces was so immediate and transparent that Margaret had to fight not to gasp. David actually smiled before catching himself and rearranging his features into something resembling grief. Sarah reached over to squeeze Margaret's hand, but her touch felt cold and calculating. The house on Maple Street, valued at approximately $2.1 million, will be sold and proceeds divided equally, Thomas continued. The business, Mom's Catering Company, with its contracts and equipment valued at roughly $800,000, will also be liquidated and split 3 ways. What about her investment accounts? Michael asked, his voice barely containing his excitement. Those total approximately $400,000, also to be divided equally among the 3 of you. Margaret watched her youngest son's shoulders sag with visible relief. The boy who used to bring her dandelions and call them the most beautiful flowers in the world was now calculating how his mother's death would save him from bankruptcy. There is one stipulation, Thomas added with perfect gravity. The will specifies that the funeral arrangements should be modest but dignified, with any remaining funds after expenses going to the beneficiaries. Of course, David said quickly, we'd want to honor Mom's memory appropriately. Such beautiful liars, Margaret thought. She'd heard them planning her $5,000 cremation just yesterday. As Thomas packed away the false will, Margaret's children each took turns holding her hand, whispering words of love that rang hollow as coins dropped on concrete. Sarah even managed to produce tears, though Margaret noticed how carefully she dabbed at them to preserve her makeup. After they left, promising to return tomorrow with final arrangements, Margaret allowed herself one genuine moment of heartbreak. Then she reached for her phone and dialed the hospital's number. This is Margaret Coleman in room 314. I need you to call my family. Tell them I've taken a turn for the worse. Rosa Mendoza had been cleaning the windows in Margaret's hospital room when the children arrived for their inheritance discussion the day before. What they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to learn in all their years of treating her like furniture, was that Rosa spoke perfect English. She'd been listening to their cruel calculations while methodically polishing glass, her weathered hands steady even as her heart broke for the woman who'd become far more than an employer. When Rosa slipped into Margaret's room that evening, her dark eyes were bright with unshed tears. Senora Margaret, she whispered, I heard everything. Those children of yours, ... double quotes. She shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. 15 years, Rosa, Margaret said softly, reaching for her friend's calloused hand. 15 years you've been more of a family to me than they have. You remembered my birthday when they forgot. You brought me soup when I was sick while they were too busy to call. Rosa had started working for Margaret when her own world fell apart. A recent widow with 2 young children and no money, Margaret had hired her not just as a housekeeper, but had helped her get citizenship papers, paid for her children's school supplies, and had been in the front row when Rosa's daughter graduated from nursing school and her son from community college with an accounting degree. You know what I realized lying here, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. I spent 40 years pouring love into 3 ungrateful vessels with holes in the bottom, while the woman who actually cares about me has been right there, invisible to everyone but me. Rosa's nephew Carlos arrived an hour later, a serious young man in his 3rd year of law school whom Margaret had quietly helped with textbook money and tuition payments. His eyes widened as Margaret explained her plan. "You want me to help you fake your death?" he asked incredulously. "Not fake it permanently," Margaret clarified with a sharpness that reminded everyone in the room why she'd built a successful business from nothing. "Just stage it convincingly enough to see how they behave when they think I'm really gone. Rosa, you've seen them visit me exactly twice in 5 days. Have they asked about my comfort, my pain, whether I need anything?" Rosa shook her head. "They asked the nurses about your condition, but only when they think no one is listening, and always the same question: how much longer?" Margaret pulled out her phone and showed them photos she'd been secretly taking. "I've been documenting everything: their conversations about my money, their funeral planning, even Sarah looking up vacation rentals on her phone while sitting beside my deathbed. I want them to show their true nature one final time." "And then?" Carlos asked. Margaret's smile was rare. "Then they'll learn that the real will, the one I'm having you draft tonight, leaves everything to someone who actually loves me, instead of someone who sees me as a death benefit." Rosa gasped. "Signora, no, I couldn't." "You could, and you will," Margaret said firmly. "You've earned every penny by being the daughter I thought I had raised." Dr. Harrison had been reluctant to participate in Margaret's elaborate ruse until she showed him the photos on her phone, images of her children laughing in the hospital corridor while she lay supposedly dying just feet away. His Hippocratic oath compelled him to heal, but his human heart demanded justice for a woman who'd been betrayed by the people who should have loved her most. The death was perfectly orchestrated. Margaret was quietly transferred to a private facility where she could recover in secret, while the hospital issued a death certificate that would be quietly corrected later. Rosa handled the funeral arrangements with Margaret's guidance, choosing the modest service her children had planned, while Margaret watched from a rented car across the street, disguised behind dark sunglasses and a black wig Rosa had purchased. The performance was breathtaking in its audacity. David stood at the podium of the small funeral home chapel, his voice breaking with perfectly manufactured emotion as he spoke about his beloved mother's selfless sacrifices. Margaret watched him through binoculars, noting how he kept glancing at his Rolex, the one she'd bought him for his medical school graduation. "She gave us everything," David proclaimed to the modest gathering of neighbors and former catering clients. "Her love knew no bounds, her generosity had no limits." Behind him, Sarah dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while simultaneously texting under her program. Margaret zoomed in with her phone camera, capturing the message Sarah was sending to someone named Jake. "Funeral almost over. Meet me at the Ritz for champagne later." Michael's eulogy was perhaps the most nauseating. He spoke about Margaret's unconditional love and how she'd always believed in her children's dreams, his voice quavering with false sentiment. What the mourners couldn't see was his other hand scrolling through luxury car listings on his phone, already shopping for his inheritance windfall. The receiving line after the service provided Margaret with her most damning evidence yet. She watched through her camera lens as her children accepted condolences with appropriate gravity, then immediately huddled together between mourners to whisper about estate lawyers and bank transfers. "The realtor says we can list the house next week," Sarah hissed during a break in the sympathy line. "I've already called about liquidating the business," Michael whispered back. "We could have cash in hand within 30 days. Remember," David cautioned quietly, "we need to look appropriately grieved for at least a few weeks. No major purchases until the estate clears probate." The most heartbreaking moment came when Rosa approached the casket, with genuine tears streaming down her face. She'd known the casket was empty, but her grief was real grief for the woman she'd watched suffer this ultimate betrayal by her own flesh and blood. As the last mourner left and her children began discussing dinner plans with the casual air of people who'd just completed a successful business transaction, Margaret finally had all the evidence she needed of who her children really were. The law offices of Brennan and Associates had never witnessed a scene quite like the one unfolding in Conference Room B. David, Sarah, and Michael sat in their best mourning attire, having rushed from their mother's funeral reception to what they believed would be a quick formality, signing papers to claim their inheritance. Thomas Brennan sat across from them with an expression that should have warned them something was terribly wrong. "Before we begin," Thomas announced, I need to clarify something about the will I read to you at the hospital. That document was ... preliminary. Your mother made significant changes in her final days. Sarah shifted impatiently in her chair. What kind of changes? I thought everything was settled. Thomas opened a different folder. This one containing legal documents that bore yesterday's date. Margaret Coleman's final will and testament, witnessed and notarized, leaves her entire estate valued at approximately $2.3 million to Rosa Mendoza, with additional bequests to the Children's Hospital Foundation, the Single Mothers Scholarship Fund, and St. Mary's Food Bank. The silence that followed was so complete that the ticking of the office clock sounded like gunshots. David was the first to find his voice. That's impossible. There must be some mistake. Rosa is the housekeeper. Rosa was your mother's closest friend and companion for 15 years. Thomas corrected. According to Margaret's written statement, Rosa showed her more genuine love and care than, and I quote, the three people who were supposed to love her most. Michael's face had turned an alarming shade of red. This is insane. We're contesting this immediately. Mom wasn't in her right mind. She was dying. She was medicated, actually. Came a familiar voice from the doorway. I was perfectly lucid. Margaret Coleman stepped into the conference room, very much alive and radiating a calm authority that none of her children had ever seen before. She was impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit, her silver hair perfectly styled, looking like a woman who'd just returned from a successful business meeting rather than her own funeral. David's mouth fell open. Sarah dropped her purse, its contents scattering across the polished floor. Michael simply stared, his brain apparently unable to process what his eyes were seeing. Hello, children, Margaret said, taking the seat at the head of the conference table, as if she owned the entire building. Lovely service today. I particularly enjoyed David's speech about my boundless love, and Michael's touching words about believing in your dreams. Very moving performances. You're alive, Sarah whispered. Remarkably so, Margaret replied. Amazing what proper medical care can accomplish when you're not too busy planning someone's budget funeral to actually ask about their prognosis. The shock was giving way to something uglier. David leaned forward, his physician's training finally kicking in. This is fraught. You faked your own death. Manipulated legal documents. I documented everything, Margaret interrupted, sliding a tablet across the table. Every conversation you had about my money while you thought I was dying, every laugh about my condition, every plan you made for my estate while I lay 3 feet away from you. The tablet showed photo after photo, their excited faces during the fake will reading, screenshots of Sarah's vacation rental searches, Michael's luxury car browsing history, David checking his investment portfolio during what he thought were his mother's final hours. You wanted me dead, Margaret continued with devastating calm, so I gave you what you wanted, and now you know exactly how it feels to lose everything you thought you were entitled to. The explosion of fury that followed was everything Margaret had expected, and more. David shot to his feet so violently his chair toppled backward, his carefully maintained physician's composure cracking like ice in a furnace. You manipulative, vindictive old woman, he snarled, his face contorted with rage that revealed the spoiled child he'd never outgrown. We'll sue you for every penny. Emotional distress, fraud, elder abusal, destroy you in court. Sarah was crying now. But these weren't the delicate tears she'd performed at the funeral. These were ugly, desperate sobs of a woman watching her financial salvation disappear. You can't do this to us. We're your children. We have rights. Rights. Margaret's voice cut through their hysteria like a blade. Tell me, Sarah, what right did you have to plan my cremation for under $5,000 while texting your boyfriend about champagne celebrations? What right, David, did you have to calculate my net worth while I was supposedly dying? Michael, who had been silent in shock, finally found his voice. We loved you, Mom. We were grieving. Stop. Margaret's single word carried such authority that Michael's mouth snapped shut. Don't you dare lie to me anymore. I have audio recordings. Michael, would you like me to play the part where you said this situation works out so much better than me helping with your debts while I was alive? Thomas Brennan watched the scene unfold with the fascination of a man witnessing justice served in real time. He'd seen family disputes tear apart estates before, but he'd never seen a parent so thoroughly document their children's betrayal. David was pacing now, his medical mind working through legal angles. No court will uphold this. You were declared dead. That invalidates any document signed afterward, and faking your death is illegal. Margaret smiled, and for the first time, Her children saw the steel beneath the soft exterior they'd taken advantage of for decades. Actually, David, you might want to brush up on your legal knowledge. I was never legally declared dead, just clinically deceased for a brief period before making a miraculous recovery. Happens more often than you'd think in cardiac cases. Dr. Harrison can testify to my complete mental competency throughout the entire process. She turned to Sarah, whose sobs had devolved into hiccuping gasps. And Sarah, since you're so concerned about rights, let's discuss yours. You have the right to contest this will. Certainly. Of course, that would require explaining to a judge why you were researching divorce lawyers and vacation rentals while your mother was in intensive care. The fight was draining out of them as the reality of their situation sank in. Margaret had outmaneuvered them completely, and they were too shocked to mount an effective counterattack. However, Margaret continued, her voice softening just slightly, I'm not completely heartless. Despite everything, you are still my children. And some part of me hopes there's still something worth salvaging in the people I raised. She slid 3 envelopes across the table. Thomas has prepared modest trust funds for each of you, $50,000 each, contingent on specific conditions. You'll need to attend family counseling, perform community service, and demonstrate genuine efforts to repair our relationship. The money will be released gradually over 5 years, assuming you meet the requirements. David stared at the envelope like it contained a snake. 50,000, that's nothing. It's more than you deserve, Margaret replied evenly, and infinitely more than Rosa ever asked for in 15 years of actual love and loyalty. The choice was theirs. Swallow their pride and accept her terms, or walk away with nothing but the bitter taste of their own greed. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Margaret's new apartment, a cozy 2-bedroom unit in a vibrant senior community, where laughter echoed through the hallways and neighbors actually knew each other's names. 6 months had passed since that devastating confrontation in Thomas Brennan's office, and Margaret was finally learning what it felt like to live for herself rather than pour herself out for people who saw her as a resource to be depleted. Rosa bustled around the kitchen, humming a Spanish lullaby while preparing their traditional Saturday breakfast. At Margaret's insistence, she'd moved into the 2nd bedroom, though she'd initially protested that it felt wrong to live in such luxury. Now she was enrolled in nursing school, her tuition paid by the scholarship fund Margaret had established. Her children visited every weekend, bringing their own children to call Margaret Abuela, a title that filled her heart in ways her biological grandchildren never had. The counselor called, Rosa said gently, setting down a plate of fresh fruit. Sarah's session went well yesterday. She's asking if you're ready to meet for coffee next week. Margaret nodded, feeling the familiar mixture of hope and wariness that thoughts of Sarah always brought. Of her 3 children, only Sarah had chosen to accept the conditional trust in its requirements. The weekly therapy sessions had been brutal at first, Sarah's anger and entitlement clashing against Margaret's newfound boundaries like waves against a seawall. But slowly, painfully, something resembling honesty had begun to emerge. David and Michael had made their choice immediately and definitively. David had stormed out of the lawyer's office, threatening lawsuits that never materialized once he realized the strength of Margaret's documentation. Michael had taken a different approach, alternating between rage and manipulation, trying to guilt Margaret into changing her mind by invoking memories of his childhood. Neither strategy had worked, and both men had ultimately chosen their pride over any chance of reconciliation. I miss them, Margaret admitted to Rosa, surprising herself with the confession. Not who they became, but who I thought they were. Who they might have been if I'd been a different kind of mother. Rosa sat beside her, taking her hand with the gentle strength that had sustained Margaret through the hardest months of her life. You gave them everything a mother could give. Señora, you cannot make someone love you. You can only choose to love yourself enough to stop accepting less than you deserve. The doorbell chimed, and Rosa's face lit up. That will be Carlos with the good news. Carlos. Mendoza entered with a broad smile and a manila envelope that contained the final documentation of Margaret's estate restructuring. Rosa's catering company, the renamed and expanded version of Margaret's business, was thriving under joint management. Carlos had graduated law school summa cum laude with his tuition fully paid, and was now handling Margaret's charitable foundation work. The scholarship fund has approved 15 more recipients, Carlos announced proudly. Single mothers, all of them, starting their business degree programs next semester. Margaret felt the deep satisfaction that had become her constant companion. Every dollar she'd once planned to leave to her ungrateful children was now creating opportunities for people who would use the gifts wisely, who would pay the generosity forward rather than squander it on self. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Mom, I know I have no right to ask, but could we meet at the park instead of the coffee shop? I want to show you something I've been working on. For the first time in months, Margaret felt a flutter of genuine curiosity about one of her children. Sarah's messages had become less demanding and more thoughtful lately, less focused on what she needed and more on what she might offer. I think I'm ready, Margaret told Rosa, who squeezed her hand in response. That evening, Margaret sat on her balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, desperate to be loved, willing to accept crumbs of affection from people who saw her as a bank account with legs. That woman had died in that hospital bed, listening to her children laugh about her funeral arrangements. The woman who had emerged from that death was someone Margaret was still getting to know. Strong, selective with her love, fierce in protecting her peace. She'd learned that real family wasn't about blood or obligation, but about choice and genuine care. She'd discovered that the most important relationship she could nurture was the one with herself, and that loving someone didn't mean accepting their mistreatment. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret smiled. Tomorrow she would meet with Sarah, and she would listen with both hope and boundaries. She would continue building her chosen family with Rosa and Carlos, continue funding dreams for people who understood the value of opportunity. She had finally learned to live